Europe's new reality. Coordinated attacks on Belgium's capital leave dozens dead. The third large-scale attack in Europe in the past 15 months. Why was Brussels targeted, and how should Belgium and other European countries deal with the homegrown threat? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. It's a process of shock, grief and anger that is becoming all too familiar for many people. Brussels, the latest European capital to be targeted by a deadly attack claimed by ISIL. It happened days after the Belgian police were being commended for capturing Europe's most wanted man. Salah Abdeslam had been on the run since the Paris attacks last November. Belgium raised its security level in the wake of those attacks and put thousands of soldiers on the street, and yet was seemingly powerless to stop attacks on two conspicuous targets, Brussels airport and a metro station near the headquarters of the European Union. Well, now questions are being asked about why Belgium has become a hub for a network of attackers linked to ISIL, and whether European intelligence agencies have underestimated how large those networks are. Well, France and Belgium have been the focus of several recent plots. The Paris-based satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo and a Jewish supermarket were targeted 14 months ago. The French capital was again targeted last November with simultaneous shootings and bombings that killed 129 people. A few days later, Belgian national Abdelhamid Abaoud, suspected of organizing the November 13th attacks, was killed in a police raid in northern Paris. The only surviving attacker in that plot, Salah Abdeslam, was, as we mentioned, captured last week by Belgian police. He is also suspected of involvement in Tuesday's attacks in Brussels. Well, let's bring in our guests now for today's Inside Story. From Brussels is Bruno Lete. He's a senior officer for foreign and security policy with the German Marshall Fund. From Paris, we have Mathieu Guidere, professor of Islamic studies at the University of Toulouse. He also specializes on the psychology of terrorism and radicalization. And finally, Ewen MacAskill. He's the defense and intelligence correspondent for the Guardian newspaper. He's live from London. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on Inside Story. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about, but I first want to get your quick thoughts on what this means for Belgium and Europe going forward. Starting with you, Bruno, in Brussels. Is Europe going to have to accept now that these types of attacks are going to be the norm?
Well, I think that many of the questions that were already raised during the Paris attacks will now be reinforced in the wake of what happened in Brussels. Certainly at the domestic level, inside our countries, is our model of liberal tolerance still compatible enough to face religious extremism? What do we do with the balance versus the need for privacy and the need for security? And of course, there's also an external dimension to the questions. There's a link to the wars in Syria and the rise of extremist groups in the Sahel and the Levant. How will the European Union effectively or more effectively deal with that as well? So I guess these are really questions that will be brought up on the agenda more and more.
Mathieu Guidere in Paris, is Europe going to be safe anytime soon?
No, I don't think Europe will be safe before probably months or years, because we are entering a new era of copycat, imitation of terrorism that we saw in Paris in the last few months, and it is very difficult to deal with either on the operational level or on the intelligence level.
Ewen MacAskill in London, do you agree that this is likely not to be the last attack on European soil?
Yes, I agree with that. I think people might as well get used to the idea that this is a conflict that's going to last at least a generation. It all stems from the Middle East. If you look at, say, Iraq, the assault on Mosul might be months or maybe a year before Mosul is retaken. Retaking Raqqa from Islamic State, you're probably looking at a few years. If Islamic State go, it will be some other group. So that immediate cause of this conflict, that running sore is always going to be there for the foreseeable future. And when you combine that with the deep feelings of alienation among young Muslims in many parts of Europe, that's a pretty fatal cocktail.
Okay, I want to focus on Brussels and this latest attack a bit more now, Bruno. The signs were there, of course. I mean, there were warnings even before the arrest of Salah Abdeslam in Molenbeek last week. We all recall, of course, the lockdown at the end of last year after the Paris attacks. Was it just simply impossible, in your view, for Belgian security forces to prevent such an attack from happening?
Now, of course, we are facing this important question of how to secure soft targets. This is something that we don't quite yet well understand, I think, not only in Belgium, but across the globe. But let me perhaps also, express some disagreement first with some of the international commentaries towards Belgium and its security apparatus. Some media have been very far and were very strong about even calling Belgium a failed state. Now, to my knowledge, there have not been more or there have not been less terrorist attacks in Belgium than in any other European country. I don't really think it's an issue here of security forces. I do think, though, that, and there is where I would agree, that there has been a serious problem or failing policies of integration and anti-radicalization. But this, of course, is not only in Belgium. I mean, countries like France, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom face the same issue.
But with these particular attacks, Bruno, sorry to interrupt you. With these particular attacks, Bruno, though, I mean, the suspects, the Brakrawi brothers and Lachraoui, were known to the Belgian security services. They had criminal records. So was the eye taken off the ball?
Now, of course, these are difficult judgments to make. There is a judiciary system. The brothers that you just mentioned were doing their time in prison. They had been caught, but of course there are some ways. They were released earlier, of course, after having done their time. So I think that, the issue here as well, and, there I would probably admit that some commentaries were right, that there's a very high level of tolerance, perhaps, that, have been a little bit too far. Sometimes I would even say that Belgian authorities have perhaps been a bit in denial about the problem, not wanting to accept that this is really happening, despite many signals on the forefront. But again, I don't believe that there's a failing security apparatus in this country. I really do believe that it's rather an issue of, failing policies towards integration and anti-radicalization.
Ewen, in London, on this particular attack, it's believed that about 30 men were involved in the Paris attacks last November. Do you think that the Brussels perpetrators are the remnants of that Paris cell, or do you think that what's happened here is a new network? I mean, that Salah Abdeslam connected with a new network?
Well, there could be a new network. I mean, one of the worrying trend, what we've seen mainly in Europe up until Charlie Hebdo is sort of lone wolf attacks, homegrown terrorists, disgruntled youngsters, and the links were to Al Qaeda. Now, as a result of Islamic State, we've got something completely different and very worrying. What we have now is sort of coordinated campaigns, almost guerrilla-style tactics, where you have groups involved in tactical attacks. We saw that in Paris. It wasn't one or two gunmen or people with suicide vests going out into the streets, attacking a handful of people. These were coordinated attacks on multiple targets. And this is a trend that's going to continue. So I think even if you were to hope that this particular cell had been wrapped up, the continuation of this kind of coordinated urban guerrilla-style attacks is here to stay.
Mathieu Guidere in Paris, much of the attention in the aftermath of the Paris attacks last November focused, of course, on French problems such as the disenfranchisement in the banlieue and the segregations in the banlieue, the suburbs of Paris, and also the radicalization in the prison system in France. But it seems, when you look at Belgium today, that Belgium may suffer from even worse problems than France. Explain to us the difference between France and Belgium when dealing with this homegrown threat.
If you take a look in the past, in the two late last decades, We had the same problem in London at some point in the 90s when France was confronted with the the Islamic groups, the GIA, what you call the GIA, who made many attacks in Paris in 1995. At the time, we were blaming England and especially London for being a Londonistan. And in France, there have been many books about the Londonistan, about these groups that are hosted by London, who are Islamists, who are from Algeria, and who established likelihood there, who established many communities that are not very different from the jihadist and the Islamist communities who are established in Molenbeek or anywhere else in France in the 90s. It's just a move of communities. What happened during the 90s is that the Algerian networks has dominated the jihadi trend and the jihadi movement all over Europe because of the civilian war in Algeria. During the 2000s, you have all these Morocco who established in Morocco, in Belgium especially, the Morocco networks, first for the drugs, and then they moved to connect with the jihadists in Iraq. Belgium was the first country to send at the time the first suicide bomber as a woman, Muriel Ducoq, who exploded herself in Iraq. So this establishment of a new community of Islamists and radical in Belgium, and especially in Brussels suburbs, was very followed by the government. And Belgium is not really the target, the premium target. It became a target because after the attacks of January in France 2015, and especially after November 2015, the second series of attacks, they have been urged by their colleagues in France to look into this and to go after all these Islamists who were leaving to Syria. And that's the backlash. It's the boomerang of this going against these communities. But in the first place, Belgium was not a primary target to the jihadists or to the Islamic State.
Well, you mentioned the 1990s and the UK. In the 1990s, when Al-Qaeda was the dominant so-called terrorist group, all their links were in the UK at the time, but we're seeing a shift now with the emergence of ISIL. They seem to have much stronger ties with continental Europe. Why do you think that is, Ewen MacAskill in London?
I would take issue in the first place with what Bruno said about the Belgian intelligence services. I think they're severely understaffed. The level of coordination isn't good, and there's not much collaboration between the Belgian intelligence agencies and the Belgian police, and there's not particularly good collaboration and coordination with other European intelligence partners. Now, the reason I mention that is exactly the point that you've made. Up into the London bombing in 2005, the same accusations could be made against the British intelligence services, but they learned their lesson from that. Instead of MI6, the international intelligence agency, who tended to be arrogant and not share information, and GCHQ, the surveillance agency, didn't share information with the others unless it had to, and MI5, the domestic agency, and then very little working with the domestic police. As a result of the London bombing, that all changed. Now they work together much more closely. All these old barriers have gone.
Okay.
You get groups from each agency working for the others. And they've also reached out into the Muslim communities throughout the UK.
Okay.
They have community policing. So it's a completely different approach.
A different approach. Bruno, in Brussels, what about that idea that Belgium is an easy target because of Belgium's fragmented system of governance?
Right. Well, I agree with some of the things that I heard. Obviously, there are situations here that don't really make a lot of sense. I mean, if you look at the city of Brussels, for instance, there are exactly 3 different police corps to cover 3 different areas of the city. And there have been examples where those 3 police corpses didn't really cooperate, at the most efficient level, I would say. But I would also like to take it perhaps beyond just Belgium, because really what is the issue here is that, in Europe we still have a national approach towards a problem that is actually not bound to borders. Terrorism is a cross-border phenomenon, but still here in Europe, because of issues of national security or sovereignty, we're still trying to deal with this at the national level. This has to change. Look at the EU, there are still 28 different intelligence agencies, there are 28 different information databases, there are 28 different police corpses.
Right.
And this
but how can
also
they deal with it on the national level? Precisely on
that.
How can Europe deal with it on the bloc level and not on the national level when you consider that the European Union doesn't have a military force of its own? I mean, each individual country, as you say, has been taking action on its own.
Well, I don't think that military force will really be the best solution to deal with this problem. But definitely in Belgium, I would say that if Brussels should be a strong signal also to our government. You may know that Belgium has about 5 or 6 different governments and 6 or 7 different parliaments. There's a lot of, sometimes cultural tensions between North and South. So that is true. This background is there. But if I hear the first commentaries, whether it is from our Prime Minister or whether it is from politicians from both sides of the country, both North and South, from the Dutch-speaking side or the Francophone-speaking side, I have been struck by the unity that has been shown in the past 24 hours. A unity that has also started to emerge since Paris. Yeah. But that now I think,
some would say that's come a little too late.
No other choice.
Yeah, but some would say that unity has come a little too late in the case of Paris and in the case of Belgium. Let me bring in Mathieu Guidere to understand a bit more the motivations of these young men who decide to conduct attacks on their own soil, because many of these young men, as has been the case in Paris, were born actually in countries like France and Belgium, even though they're of North African origin. Mathieu Guidere, you've spoken to some of these fighters. Tell us about their background a bit more and their motivation as well.
So our studies about the motivations and the mobiles of these fighters are divided in 2 main categories. You have internal mobiles, which are people born in France, who lived in France and who feel discriminated, who feel like not being able to live their religion as they would like in France. They fear racism, segregation, and then they become resentful and hateful, and they decide either to join ISIS or to attack France on its soil. And you have the second category, which is the external motivations. These people are motivated by the fact of responding to the military intervention of France in Syria and Iraq and other parts of the Islamic countries like Mali or Libya or other parts. And these motivations are more geopolitical and against the military intervention, the military place of France in these. And these 2 combinations are hosted by a cultural environment in France which values the revolutionary spirit and makes anyone who almost uses violence for political or ideological targets or ideological goal as a revolutionary person. So the combination of all these factors make it explosive as a mobile or motivation.
A lot has been said, and so how do you deal with it, Mathieu? A lot has been said about the role of Muslim leaders in these communities, the role of imams and so on, that they should be more involved. I mean, we heard a lot of French politicians say this, Mathieu, but is the solution really there? Do imams have a role to play, and are these young men actually being radicalized in mosques?
Actually, the radicalization in mosques is very minor compared to, for example, the radicalization on the internet or the social networks. And what happened now is that the pressure of the authorities of the government towards these leaders, community leaders, towards these imams who are in France and who are not radicalized, all of them, made it that the youth, the young people in these suburbs, in these communities, do no longer listen to these people, to these community leaders, and have their own leaders on the internet, on the social networks, and do not believe them, do not listen to them. So we lost contact. We are no longer in touch with a part of these young people who get radicalized.
Bruno, Lete, you believe that Muslim leaders in these communities should be more involved and more vocal, right?
No, I do believe, and especially also because, I don't know, definitely in Belgium, this is something that has not been looked in properly. We are now actually starting to look into organizing state courses, courses organized by the government for a new generation of imams. Our foreign minister, Didier Reynders, the Belgian Minister of Foreign Affairs, has called to create some sort of Euro-Islam, just in the realization that religion and liberalism is not contradictory to each other. I think there's also definitely something that has to be done at the school level, not only universities, but also high school and colleges. I mean, in this country, it is very difficult to simply study Islam through the official state channels or government or public channels. So these are definitely options that we need to look into, and hopefully this will also be a way to counter this form of radicalization. But I do agree, though, with my colleague in Paris that we also need to be more aggressive in our social media strategy and tactic there, because I do agree that this is definitely a problem as well.
Ewen MacAskill in London, from a security standpoint, I think the reality today is that Europe is much more threatened by ISIL than the United States. So where, in your opinion, does the problem need to be addressed from? Do you start in the Middle East or do you start in Europe itself?
Well, you have to do both. Until you resolve the situation in Syria and Iraq and as always, the running sore of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then that's always going to be a source of conflict. For the problems in Europe, I would argue that in Britain there's a much more multiculturalism is still works. That ideal is still holds. There's not the same level of alienation in the UK as there is in, say, France and Belgium. In 2007, the British government started a programme called Prevent, and that was aimed at, it's a sort of anti-radicalisation programme. Now, it's got lots of flaws, lots of problems. They ask the imams to reach out to young people, and maybe older imams aren't always the best people. But at the same time, some of those imams are then seen as spouting government propaganda, or they're worried that they may be spying on them. But in spite of that, overall, it has been a success. And it's now expanded from mosques and schools. There's now a legal obligation in Britain, universities, and into prisons as well.
Okay, Mathieu Guidere, you have the last word. Do you see Europe changing its course in the aftermath of these latest attacks? We're already seeing, civil liberties being threatened in places like France. Is it going to get worse now, you think?
It is a unique opportunity, what happened in Brussels, for the European leader to think about a European intelligence agency, for example, to deal with this problem on a cross-cultural, cross-borders problem. And on the other level, it is our role, our mission to explain to the people that terrorism is a very difficult and a long fight that has to be done in all the levels, on the education level and also on the media level.
Thank you so much for an interesting discussion, gentlemen. Bruno Lete in Brussels, Mathieu Guidere and Ewen MacAskill. Thank you all. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. You can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. As always, our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.